Excellent. Thank you very much, Jens. This was really enlightening. And it's definitely a positive development to include these environmental and climate considerations in the existing core models of used in Danish policymaking. But the question is still, what is the best way to go about it, this integration challenge, and what are the implications of drawing on other theories of economic thought? It's a common phrase among economists to say that it takes a model to beat a model. And while I'm personally not always persuaded by the saying, I'm nonetheless delighted to welcome Hector Pollitt, who indeed has another kind of model, the E3ME model. Welcome, Hector. Can you share your slides?
Thank you.
And I have a few more words to introduce you. You are the chief economist at Cambridge Econometrics, which is, as an organization, was earlier this year named as one of the UK's leading management consultants groups by the Financial Times. Hector Pollitt is also a departmental fellow at the University of Cambridge and has numerous academic publications behind him. And he's worked with this model in over 15 years and contributed to some of the EU's high-profile impact assessments of climate policies. And I met Hector at a post-Keynesian economics conference in London 2 years ago, and I've kept an eye out for his work ever since. And it's been really thought stimulating. So thank you for that. The E3ME model has aspects from evolutionary economics on endogenous innovation, post-Keynesian economics with regard to the role of demand, the financial sector, and model structure. And with that said, I will welcome Hector. Please take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I think you've probably been talking to our marketing people. It's too kind. Yeah, I'm not going to try and beat one model with another. It's an alternative approach I'm going to present. I do look forward to the discussion afterwards. Now that I'm sharing the screen, I can't see the questions or chat anymore, but I look forward to coming back to that at the end. Right. Oh dear. Okay. I've probably got far too many slides, and I'm worried to see how close we're keeping to time. So I'll talk a bit about the underlying theory and the background, how we put that into the model, which is the key question, some example results to make it all look a bit more tangible, and then a few brief conclusions at the end. Also, for anyone that's interested, the EEIST project is about sort of interpreting complexity in the process of climate policy. Has a lot more on this, and I'll give the link at the end again. Okay, before we get into that, I just thought I'd throw this slide in. Recently in the UK, we had the pleasure of going through the process of Brexit. We had our Brexit minister, David Davis, who decided to say, I'm not a fan of economic models because they have all proven wrong. Yes, well, that was an excuse not to do any evaluations of Brexit in the UK. But I think there was a bit of a feeling that there wasn't grounds behind this, partly because the models were not answering the questions that people wanted asked, but also they were providing misleading results at times. So while this was an example of political hubris, I think there was a feeling that there is something to be done here, and how the link at the bottom goes into that in a bit more detail. Okay, so let's start with the theory. And as we were Rethinking Economics event, Asker already gave you introduction to Cambridge Econometrics. If you want to know about the company, look at the right-hand side. I'm more interested in the left-hand side of this. The company was originally a spin-off from the University of Cambridge Department of Applied Economics, of course, where a lot of the post-Keynesian research was being done. At the time, Richard Stone, who's the chap on the left, who developed the National Accounting Framework, of course, was closely related, a student of Keynes himself. So the lineage goes back actually to Keynes, and then Terry Barker founded the company. Originally was a student of Richard Stone. So we've always had post-Keynesian economics at the heart of our thinking, even before the modeling was developed, and the model I'm going to talk about was developed in the mid 1990s, so sort of halfway through this chart. But post-Keynesian economics always been right at the heart. So I sometimes use a summary post-Keynesian economics for people that want a brief introduction. I do recommend the book by J.E. King. It gives a really easy to read introduction. Some of the key points listed on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side of this slide. But I wanted to point out that when we're talking about the environment and ecological sustainability, there's quite a lot missing here. So post-Keynesian economics was empirically accurate and really good for sort of looking at the economic system in a demand-driven nature, but doesn't have much to say about technology. It doesn't have much to say about ecological limits. This is partly because at the time when Keynes was developing the theory, the environment wasn't, well, we weren't really looking at these ecological limits because there was the war rationing and how to allocate production, which he was interested in. But it's only much more recently that we've come to think about pure ecological limits. And it's probably fair to say Keynes would have been interested in it if he was doing all of this now. But point is, we need to look a bit further than pure Keynesian theory. Fortunately, we have the evolutionary school and more recently complexity, a few examples of really good works to look at on the right-hand side. It's really changing the way of thinking. We're talking about a low carbon transition. Transition means change. This change is mostly going to be driven by technology. Now, I don't want to say technology is the answer to everything, but we're certainly not going to get very far without it. So we do need to understand how technology develops, how technology gets into the system, and really these are the theories that we're drawing upon to do that. Okay, and then the last one, ecological limits, really talking about the constraints. Again, some works that we've been pulling on, original limits to growth and Georgescu-Roegen and entropy, both from the early 1970s, and then more recently I saw questions about the donut had already come up in the questions, but certainly easier to read than Georgescu-Roegen. Let's put it that way. But yeah, we do have to respect these constraints. They are real. We can't just assume them away, and they are a lot of the reasons that we are doing the research and the analysis that we're doing. So really trying to get this a core part of the modeling is quite important. And I'll show in a few slides' time exactly how we've been going about doing that. So last slide on the theory, you can tell I made this diagram myself rather than from any designer. Been thinking about how to represent these three distinct strands of theory in a single diagram. And it's, okay, we've got the circle on the outside, which are the ecological boundaries. I think most people would agree with that. But then on the inside, we've got an economy that's trying to grow, and it tries to grow naturally because of heterogeneity, companies competing with each other, people competing with each other, which is leading to innovation, process innovation and product innovation, which have completely different types of economic impacts and environmental impacts. But when you put them together, you get economic growth over time. And then, of course, how that impacts on jobs and unemployment and other key economic indicators. So we've got a system that's trying to grow inside these limits, but the limits are fixed, they're not moving. And while technology has some influence, we have these basic constraints that we can't get around. So that's the basic thinking. Now, of course, the question is how to put that into the model, and now it gets a bit more complicated. Now, this slide definitely is from our marketing department. It's much nicer than anything I could produce. There's a basic schematic of the E3ME model, looking at the different modules. We put technology right at the key because technology is so core and it cuts across all the different areas that we're looking at. So the economy, the environmental system, but other things as well. But then I think the key part of this diagram is really the linkages between the different boxes. There are lots of models that look at each one in isolation, but getting everything consistent, and it's involved mixing economic and physical units, so sort of systems dynamics type approach. This is what's really important, having a representation of the economy that's consistent with the physical world in which it operates. And that's really what has always been the core strength of the model. I'll do one slide on each of the three areas of theory. So the economics first, standard national accounting representation, demand driven by nature of the sort of the big arrow going from the top right to the bottom left, showing that it is the level of aggregate demand that determines the level of output, with supply adjusting unless there are constraints to do so. And I think there's some quite strong parallels with presentation from Jens here. It's very much a demand-driven system. For maybe more standard CG-focused people to how to get the level of output, you could think of it as a sort of big multiplier exercise, but you've got the input output table on the top left, but you make final demand endogenous as well. Of course, there's prices sitting on top of this, but then go around this loop repeatedly until it converges to a steady state outcome with supply and demand being equal. That's roughly how it solves. Similar to a multiplier if you did it iteratively rather than inverting the matrix. Technology evolution, I'll have to refer to my longtime co-author Jean-Francois Mercure here, who developed these models. The two key curves are the ones at the top right, the S-shaped diffusion, which we've already heard about, and this is from competing technologies. Investors having the choice of technology, choosing the one that's not just necessarily the cheapest, but the one that they know about, has cost advantages. Again, heterogeneity absolutely key in determining this. The learning curves, which most people are familiar with, as the costs come down over time as the technologies get adopted. You put those two things together, when you get to that steep part of the S-shaped curve, you can get rapid transition. And really what a lot of we're doing in the modeling is trying to identify the policies that make things happen quickly by hitting the right part of those curves. So we can't do this for every sector of the economy. That would require knowing every single technology in existence, and we're not there yet or ever. But we do have it for the key sectors in terms of emission. So power sector, cars, steel and buildings. And gradually as time goes on, that list is getting longer. But this, again, putting technology at the center of it, I think is really quite important. Ecological constraints. Now here it's more difficult because there are questions about data. There's questions about defining the constraints. The charts show the supply curves for energy resources, including renewable annual flows, but on the left, and the fossil fuel limited stocks on the right. We would really love to get something similar for sort of the key material types, especially questions that are coming up with rare earths and things like that, could be really important. But even then, I think we're still very much aware that there are ecological constraints that we're missing, especially once you get into topics such as biodiversity, and the idea is that it's the extraction of the materials and the damage to ecosystems that is really harming our environment, rather than just the consumption of the resources. So I think here it's fair to say there is quite a lot more to do. Right, see how I'm doing on time. So some results. What does this all mean? So starting off with a chart that maybe some of you are familiar with from the IPCC 5th assessment report, looking at the costs of meeting a 2-degree target compared to a baseline. And the chart on the right-hand side is basically taken from the model database that was used with all the runs of all the integrated assessment models getting to 2 degrees. And it looks very positive because it's all bars going upwards, some of them quite high, but in fact, it's a chart of costs. So it's taken a negative light. And you can see that every single model, with one exception in 2100, which I admit I've never actually found out what that was or how they did it. But the models are just showing estimates of costs. And the narrative that comes out of this is basically costs. And the aim of policy is to try to minimize these costs, which is in fact what the models are doing. They're aiming to minimize these costs. Now that comes basically straight out of neoclassical economics, looking at ways of optimizing a system. Your baseline is optimized, your 2 degree scenarios are constrained, optimized systems, so by nature, things can only get worse. Now, if we drop the assumptions about optimization, and this is effectively coming straight from Keynes' original work, because there's uncertainty, we're unable to optimize behavior because there are things we just don't know about. And a more simulation-based approach from E3ME doesn't necessarily lead to these costs. And here's one example from a European Commission study, which was looking at getting to 2 degree target for the EU by the year 2050. And the table at the bottom is showing 5 different scenarios, all of which get to minus 80% emissions for the EU, run with 2 different models, E3ME, the Cambridge model, the top row, GEMI3 is a CG neoclassical model. And you can see they've got to opposite results, basically because of these assumptions about capacity within the economy. If there's spare capacity, like E3ME says, boost it with investment, use that capacity, GDP increases. If you have the crowding out, like in the CG models, then you lose the investment from elsewhere. I thought it was really interesting when Jens presented that this crowding out isn't there, because absolutely critical to the results that come out of the model. Now, this is what has now been adopted as the EU's long-term strategy. Cañete was the head of DG Climate Action at the European Commission at the time. And there was tons of modeling work that went into long-term strategy using a whole range of different models. But we were quite surprised in Cambridge when this tweet came out, which was basically the E3ME results put into Twitter, and they're focusing on the GDP benefits and the particular benefits for the EU from reducing energy imports. That even though the other modeling was finding the opposite results, this is what they decided to go with, the sort of the headline results, and you can see the FT was reporting on it as well. So certainly benefits for the EU from that, and it's not just a story of EU benefits because it imports a lot of energy. At global level, you can see this because what we're effectively doing is changing the trajectory of technology, and it's not we go to a world where it's the same, but there are some costs. We're going to a different world. It is a set of different sets of means of production based on different technologies. And whether that comes out better or worse just depends on the nature of the technologies that you use. So this was the new climate economy report, which got presented at the UN headquarters 2 or 3 years ago. And that's all the macro outcomes. I did want to add this, the focus on carbon taxes. Once we drop the assumptions of perfect markets don't always become the best outcomes. So these stories about carbon taxes solving all the problems, we have to get away from this narrative. It really is not helpful. What we need is policies that develop the technologies at each stage of the innovation cycle. Now, carbon taxes are important towards the end of that cycle, but they don't really help much earlier on. So we need a mix of policies, and the interaction of policies is really important here. So there's more detail in that post, which I should have added the link to. So key conclusions, because I'm sure I'm running out of time already. Different modeling approaches. So there is this basic divide between optimization and simulation. Now, what I've been presenting is very much a simulation-based approach. We put the policies in, we see how it changes technology trajectories, what it means for the economy. Now, that's a long way away from the sorts of questions that are, like, what's the best way to get to this particular outcome? We wouldn't be able to do that with the framework we have. Now, I'm often quite critical about the optimized based approaches. In principle, there is nothing wrong with it as long as you apply it to the right type of question. And it's when you start to apply the wrong modeling approach to the wrong type of question, that's when we can get into trouble. And unfortunately, sometimes neoclassical economics does obscure this and lead us in the wrong direction. So I think that's the first point, this fundamental difference. But even going beyond that, all modeling approaches have limitations and assumptions. Of course they do. They are approximations of reality, and we have to make assumptions to get to those approximations. If we didn't do that, our model would just be the whole world. There's responsibility on the modelers to make sure they're not pushing against these assumptions, so they're using their modeling tools in a responsible way. Now, I think we're all guilty of pushing that sometimes, but at the very least, we need to make as clear as possible the basis for these assumptions and how the impact on results. But I think there is also something here for the people that use the results of the models and how they're interpreted. But last point I want to make, which I'm sure will resound very well with rethinking economics, that there is benefits from what we're seeing quite often now is running different models side by side and comparing the results. Now, this is not just an academic exercise because it does yield policy insights as well. I just finished with one example from the European Union on energy efficiency policy. They ran a CG model alongside the Cambridge Keynesian model, and they got, as I showed previously, negative impact from the CG model, positive impacts from the Keynesian model. And he said, well, what do we need to do to get the positive results? And one very simple example is, well, tell the producers of all the equipment that there is going to be demand for it, so they can increase capacity in time, so that they can increase production without any crowding out, without other activities going on, and just give that message, so that it can happen. And that's the sort of thing that pluralism can really help to bring out, adding details to the results. Further information, lots of links here. More than happy to share all the slides, and of course, any questions, even after the discussion, please do bring them back to me. Thank you very much.